Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. Um, I have missed you all a ton. I got to be with you for more Sundays in a row than ever before at the beginning of Shelter in Place. But in early June, some churches realized that racism was a thing. And so I've been busy preaching about that ever since in lots of different places. And in fact, this is my second sermon of the day because earlier I was preaching to a collective of 6 congregations. They're going to get to hear from Nicola next week. So please know, first, it's next week, right, Nicola? Okay, in 2 weeks. So be aware that First Congregational Church of Oakland's theology is being spread to the masses all across the country, 6 congregations at a time. So I was really inspired when I heard about the theme for August. Around the idea of the divine's inbreaking, God inbreaking into our lives. And just as an aside, if you're bored by this point in the service and you don't really want to listen to a sermon, I invite you to go to Google Images and type in the phrase, white American doctor, and you will encounter a fabulous illustration of God's inbreaking in the illustration of Black-centered hacking, and I love it so much. And write it down and do it later if you don't want to, if you actually want to listen to the sermon. So I also wanted to acknowledge that I'm never going to listen to the song Amazing in the same way after having listened to Lee's sermon last week, which opened up the series around God's inbreaking into our lives. And I'm really grateful to get to continue from where Lee left off with our journey with Jesus. So thank you for that, Lee. So our theme for this August is really moving to me because for several months now, I've been in conversations that have been talking about how this is an apocalyptic moment. And I don't necessarily mean that in the way that we often use that term interchangeably with the idea of end times. Often those words get used as if they mean the same thing, but apocalypse actually is the word for God's radical inbreaking. And that can usher in a whole new world. It can mean the demise of the world we're in. It can be about end times. But it can also be about the subject that we're taking on during the month of August, God's divine inbreaking. This is an apocalyptic moment, a moment where God is breaking in the midst of such horror, in the midst of such injustice made visible to people who benefited from it. And it's a moment of apocalypse for all of us who are being forced to slow down or being forced to work in completely new ways, being forced to encounter community and build community in ways we never had to before. For me, this has been a season of a whole lot of women of color having very honest conversations with each other about what we're going to do now. It has been a conversation of a number of my sisters of color saying to me, you can't keep exploiting yourself and letting yourself be exploited so that white folks can learn some stuff. It's been a moment where after years of our brother BK saying to me, we don't need to be exploited to build a world that's free of exploitation. After years of BK saying that to me and to all of us, it's a season where God's inbreaking is finally possible, and I'm finally able to hear the message. It's also an apocalyptic moment in some other ways. My beloved sister Swati and I were talking last week. She is a powerhouse activist with Alliance of South Asians for, oh my gosh, Alliance of South Asians
Taking action.
It was the T, taking action. As well as being an epidemiologist, she is someone not to be messed with. Swati and I were talking last week, and she said, did you hear Dr. Fauci's press conference where he, amidst a bunch of other things, said, I didn't think I was going to have to teach people how to care about each other. In all of the things I trained for, that was not one I expected to have to teach the country. Talk about an apocalyptic moment of God's divine inbreaking into our society. Now, y'all know me well enough to know I have zero answers about what to do with these apocalyptic messages, but I wonder if this scripture does. July 4th has become a more and more painful holiday for me as the years go by. And this year, particularly as COVID has run rampant across our country in particular ways, it has really illustrated how the myth of independence that this nation in theory holds so dear will kill us. I'm particularly struck by this in some beautiful and profound ways because ever since COVID has reached these shores, AIDS activists, disability communities, Black and immigrant churches have been saying, y'all are talking about mutual aid? We know how to do mutual aid. The folks that you've been ignoring for decades are the ones who are gonna get you through this. It's an apocalyptic moment where the people that this country was built to throw away, to exploit, to ignore, to erase, are the only way we're going to get through this moment. It's an apocalyptic moment. Now, this is a weird scripture. I was looking at it again when I finally circled back to our service for today, and I found myself thinking, I can't have chosen this one randomly. This has to have been a lectionary text. I didn't look it up to confirm it, but let's blame the lectionary for the fact that we got stuck with Paul in one of his crankiest books, really being a little bit snarky with us as the text for today, as I get to talk about this beautiful romantic concept of God's divine inbreaking. It's a weird scripture, but I'm really grateful that one of the things I got out of seminary was a professor saying, I'm not all that interested in you deconstructing things before you've taken the time to wonder why the person wrote it in the first place. What was their context? What were they responding to? I find it much easier to read Paul when I remember this teaching because Paul was came off as a pretty reactive dude. He was constantly in urgency mode. And frankly, he was so urgent, much like Hamilton in the musical, because he knew he was running out of time. He was a ticking clock. He knew that what he was saying was risking his life, and he did not have long to help the congregations he was working with stop being jerks to each other. I was trying to find a non-curse way of saying that. To stop them from treating each other badly, to stop them from doing harm to each other as the way that they worshiped God. When I remember that, I find it easier to engage Paul's writings, even though he still frustrates me immensely. It's how I remember that God inbroke into Paul in ways that I can learn from as well. So as we think about, I think I originally had titled this sermon From Independence to Codependence to Interdependence, but y'all know better than I do. It's not a straight line. And so I'm finding myself looking at this passage and thinking, in some ways, it sounds like independence is the goal, for all must carry their own loads, he says. And he also says we must test our own work. But I think it's worth asking, what is our own work as far as Paul is concerned? And our own work is ironically bearing one another's burdens. So even when he's saying, get your stuff together and do it on your own, he's saying your own work is taking care of each other. What I learned recently was, if you read a little further in the text, what he's clearly responding to is that the people in the Galatian church, some of the people in the Galatian church, were feeling undervalued. They were feeling taken for granted. They were feeling like they kept pouring out and no one was pouring into them. I know I can get to that place. And this is a congregation filled with so many givers. I imagine I'm not the only one who gets there. I know that back in Paul's day, there wasn't a phrase, codependence. But as I read this passage, I find myself wondering if Paul was in some ways saying, y'all who keep pouring out all the time and getting nothing back, it doesn't have to be that way. If that's what's happening, those relationships need to be fixed. And you have your own work to do in fixing it. So for any of us who lean into codependence, and I'm not saying I'm one of them, but I'm not saying I'm not, Paul was saying we have some of our own work to do so that we can get healed. And that in the midst of that work, we're looking to build a community where everyone's pouring out and everyone's being poured into. From the myth of independence through codependence into interdependence. Now, there's a story that's been kicking around in my head for a good month that some of you may have heard before. It's about a Celtic monk and his novice, at least in the version of the story I'm telling, because Swati and I fixed it for you. And the novice was almost at the end of his training. And the Celtic monk who was training him said, "You've got one last task." And the monk reached behind him on the shelf, pulled down a bottle, and inside this sealed bottle was a fairy from the monk's personal collection. The monk handed the novice the bottle and said, "Your task is to get the fairy out of the bottle without breaking the bottle. I'll check in on you in a month." The monk comes back a month later, and the novice is almost in tears. He has not been able to figure out how to get the fairy out of that bottle. And the monk says, "Okay, I'll see you again in a month." And he comes back again, and the novice is desperate in his heartbreak. He is near ending it all because he still cannot get that fairy out of that bottle. And the monk says, "All right, I'll see you again in a month." And he comes back a month later, 3 months at this point in time, and the novice is dancing with joy. He is thrilled. He is full of the ecstasy of the divine. And there on the monk's desk is the fairy in the bottle. And the monk says, "Why are you so happy?" And the novice said, "I figured it out. Not my fairy, not my bottle." I'm going to let you sit with that one for a minute. So I find myself thinking about that quote by the Aboriginal activist Lilla Watson that many of us are so fond of. "If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you are here because your liberation is bound up in mine, then let us work together." So here's what this apocalyptic moment is breaking open for me. As I mentioned at the beginning of our time, me exploiting myself for the purpose of liberation doesn't help me. It doesn't help the people who I am in solidarity with. And it doesn't help the people who are exploiting me. Here's where it's pushing me. I have to figure out how to value myself and not place the comfort of other people above my own survival. Other people's comfort is not my ferry, and it's not my bottle. But the other thing I want us to remember as we think through this together, and it was Swati that helped get me here, is collectively, we do have a task. We have to figure out who's shoving those fairies in the bottles and stop them. And when someone who makes up rules that they impose on us and not on themselves tries to tell us what the rules are, we get to break the bottle. So, this is an unusual way to end a sermon, but I would love for us to move into small groups for a few minutes and ask yourself, what's this apocalyptic moment breaking open for you? Where is it pushing you? And where might God help